Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Elizabeth Woodville, the White Queen. One of the most revered characters during the later medieval period and pre-Tudor period is Elizabeth Woodville. She was the Queen of England through her marriage to King Edward IV, and she was known for her beauty and meteoric rise to prominence after coming from minor nobility. She was the first consort to be crowned queen, and her marriage helped elevate her siblings, but also attracted some controversy and hostility from others. Elizabeth Woodville was born around 1437 in Northamptonshire, being the first child of Sir Richard Woodville and Joachette of Luxembourg. The Woodvilles were a respected family in England and were gentry rather than noble. In around 1452, Elizabeth married her first husband, Sir John Grey of Groby. However, he was later killed fighting in the Wars of the Roses, in particular, the Second Battle of St Albans, around 9 years after they were married. He was fighting the Lancastrian cause, but this would later be shocking as Elizabeth's future husband was the Yorkist claimant to the throne and would become a strong Yorkist king. She had 2 sons from her first marriage, but she was noted for her beauty, described as the most beautiful woman in Britain. Now Edward IV had many mistresses, and he was not known for being a faithful husband. However, he began to court Elizabeth Woodville, and the pair married in secret. There is no evidence to suggest a date that they were married, but it's believed to have taken place at her family home in the early May of 1464. There were not many there to attend, with only Elizabeth's mother and 2 ladies. Edward himself had seized the throne 3 years earlier after winning a number of prominent battles in the War of the Roses, including the Battle of Towton, which is regarded as the bloodiest battle to ever take place on English soil. This battle displaced King Henry VI, and Edward seized the throne. The marriage of the pair led to a rather surprising ascent to the throne for Elizabeth Woodville, as she was crowned queen on the 26th of May 1465. This marriage caused opposition with the Earl of Warwick, as he believed he was the true power behind the throne, being known as the Warwick Kingmaker. Warwick was embarrassed and offended by Edward's marriage and actions, getting married in secret, when the plan was for him to marry a French princess. Warwick was shamed by Elizabeth's status, as she was regarded as a commoner and from a family of Lancastrian supporters, including her former ex-husband, who was a Lancastrian knight. When she became queen, many of her relatives came to court and prominence, with her sisters marrying wealthy earls. The Woodvilles were taking over the nobility of England, and their status was elevated. Elizabeth's status as a commoner, however, attracted still much criticism, and she was seen sometimes as arrogant, and she was unpopular with the king's brother, George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence. He even accused her of witchcraft. The opposition to Elizabeth contributed to one of the most shocking switches and betrayals in the War of the Roses, with George, the Duke of Clarence, and the Earl of Warwick conspiring to switch sides against Edward. The 2 accused Elizabeth's mother of witchcraft, and she was later acquitted, but the 2 left for France and began a revolt against the English king, rising up and returning before Warwick was defeated and killed in the Battle of Barnet. Edward was temporarily removed from power for a year in 1470, but following the Battle of Tewkesbury he returned, with Henry VI being killed inside the Tower of London. During the fall from power, Elizabeth hid and claimed sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, where she had given birth to a son, Edward, who would later be allegedly killed inside the Tower of London at the hands of Richard III. Elizabeth and Edward's marriage produced a huge number of children, 10 in total. However, tragedy struck in April of 1483, as Edward IV died suddenly, and Elizabeth Woodville became Queen Dowager. Her young son was kept under the control of Richard III, and was taken to the Tower of London to await his coronation with his brother, Richard the Duke of York. Elizabeth sought sanctuary during this time, and possibly sensed danger. Lord Hastings, one of Edward IV's supporters, was accused of conspiring against Richard III with Elizabeth Woodville and was executed, but it's clear Richard, the Duke of Gloucester at the time, feared Elizabeth's power. He later had Elizabeth's son, Richard Grey, and brother, Anthony Earl Rivers, executed in Pontefract Castle, and it was then declared that all of Edward IV's children and Elizabeth's were illegitimate and barred from the throne, as Edward allegedly had a pre-contract of marriage with another lady, making his marriage to Elizabeth invalid. When Richard III seized the throne following the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, and his declaration, Elizabeth was known as Dame Elizabeth Grey. She allied herself with Lady Margaret Stanley, formerly known as Beaufort, and Henry Tudor, a man with tenuous links to King Edward III, who was the closest male heir of the Lancastrian claim. Elizabeth and Margaret agreed that Henry Tudor should marry Elizabeth of York, her daughter, to solidify his claim and to get a stronger claim to the throne, and to also unite the two feuding houses of York and Lancaster. Elizabeth was stripped of her land in Richard III's Parliament, and she came out of sanctuary after the king claimed she and her daughters would not be imprisoned in any prison. The family returned to court and allegedly reconciled with the king. However, Richard was then defeated at the Battle of Bosworth Field by none other than Henry Tudor. Following Henry's rise to the throne, he married Elizabeth of York, and Elizabeth Woodville then became the Queen Dowager and had her honours restored. However, she spent the last 5 years of her life living in Bermondsey Abbey. In subsequent retirement, it's considered that she was forced into retirement to live a religious life by Henry VII, or that she could even have been linked to later Yorkist rebellions. She was treated well in the abbey and was given a royal pension and gifts from Henry VII. There was talk of her being married to the King of Scotland. However, James III of Scotland died in battle. She was visited regularly by her daughters at the abbey, but on the 8th of June 1492, she died. A letter from the time was recently discovered in the National Archives that talks about Elizabeth Woodville passing away from the plague, and it's assumed this was the cause of death. Her burial was hastily arranged, and it's assumed to reduce the spread of the plague, and because of the fear of contagion, and she was given a simple funeral. Only a small amount of mourners attended the ceremony, and it was said that it clearly felt that a queen's funeral should have been more splendid, but simplicity was Elizabeth Woodville's wish. Her coffin was taken to the same chantry as her husband, Edward IV, and she was laid to rest inside St George's Chapel, inside Windsor Castle. Elizabeth Woodville is known as the White Queen, and she was one of the most prominent figures in the War of the Roses. Today she's seen as a great female figure of the monarchy and as a woman who was involved in the politics of the period. She became the mother of the Queen of England, following Elizabeth of York's marriage to Henry VII, and today she's remembered as an important player in the Wars of the Roses. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.